So today we're going to be making the classic Italian dish spaghetti pomodoro with these homegrown tomatoes. The term pomodoro in Italian translates to tomato, so it's tomato sauce. And on the topic of the term authentic, obviously I used it to get your click, but I do find that term to be misleading in a lot of cases. Like when you look up a recipe and they're like, "This is how they make it in Italy." As if they're the possessor of some closely guarded secret and there's only one recipe and technique that exists for an entire country of 59 million people. It's one of the dumbest things a person can say when you actually think about it. Obviously, there's a shitload of authentic recipes, and I'm gonna show you one of them today. And if you like what I'm doing on this channel, make sure to subscribe because that helps me out, and let's get to it. Okay, for the sauce, let's start with 5 to 7 garlic cloves depending on their size, and all I'm going for here is a rough chop. It's all going to get blended together in the end, so this step doesn't have to be precise. And once you're done chopping, load them into a small sauce pot, and to that add 1 ounce or 2 tablespoons of olive oil along with a little bit of chili flake. I'm going with 3/4 of a teaspoon, but add this based on your preference. I wouldn't skip it all together though, because even a small amount can add background complexity without becoming too spicy. Okay, this has to cook on low for a couple of minutes to make an infused oil, and it's okay if the garlic browns a little bit, but not too much because it will turn bitter. And then we're gonna work in our tomatoes after that, and there's a few schools of thought on how to work in the tomatoes. Some chefs like to remove the skin, seeds, and gel and make what's called a tomato concasse. And you make that by cutting an X into the bottom of the tomato, plunging it into boiling water for 10 to 20 seconds until the skin seizes up. You can easily peel it off from there, and then when cutting up the tomato, you remove the gel and the seeds from there, leaving only the flesh. And the reason for that is this age-old myth that the gel and seeds contribute a bitter flavor to tomato sauces. That is not true at all. It is just that, a myth. In fact, it's beneficial to have that in the sauce because the gel contains pectin, which contributes to the consistency and texture of the final sauce, so you want that in there. It's an unnecessary step to create a refined product that actually makes the product worse in the end by not including the gel. So all I'm doing is removing the core and giving them a rough chop. I'm not gonna worry about removing the skin because it's all gonna get blended together in the end anyway. Okay, back at the stovetop, our chili garlic oil is looking pretty good, and I should mention that I usually add a few basil stems to this mixture, but for some reason I forgot to do that, so just envision them being there. So let's go ahead and add all of the tomatoes to the pot along with a very strong pinch of salt, and right away they're going to be very hard to stir and difficult to work with, but give it a few minutes and the tomatoes will gradually break down, becoming softer and releasing their juices into the pan. And once the tomatoes have reached the point of being tender, we can blend them together with a stick blender, and a little trick I like to use to prevent splattering and causing a mess is to use plastic wrap. And don't worry, it's not going to fuse itself to the pot or blow up or anything like that. Just wrap a few pieces around the blender and the pot to create a seal, and when attaching the top of the wand, don't do what I did here. Plug it in first and then attach the wand. I'm lucky this thing didn't fall out and break while I was fucking with the cord. One thing I want to point out though is when using a stick blender, I like to tilt the pot, which sort of helps feed the food into the blades. And you can blend this as little or as much as you like depending on how smooth or chunky you want the final sauce to be. For this dish, I prefer it to be smooth and thoroughly blended together. I should also mention you could use a tabletop blender or a food processor if that's what you have. Both of those will work just fine. For now though, I'm going to slide this over to the secondary burner that's set to low heat and place a pot of water over the main burner and add a pinch of salt to the water. Allow the water to heat up and come to a boil, and once it reaches that point, add a big handful of spaghetti noodles, and for some reason I like to try to force the pasta into the water like this. I really don't know why I do that, but I do it every time. Okay, while the pasta's getting ready, we've got a couple minutes to talk about basil and how to handle it. Basil is a very delicate herb, and if you've worked with it, I'm sure you've noticed that it gets discolored after cutting it. And there are a few solutions to this. One of them is to have an extremely sharp knife which can cut through cleanly without pulling and tugging on the cell structure, which leads to bruising. And another thing people like to do is to coat the knife with a little bit of olive oil, and that essentially does the same thing through lubrication. And some people also like to cut this at the last minute, with the idea being that you're gonna eat it before you see the discoloring. But honestly, if you're not a fine dining restaurant, who gives a shit? Just cut it. Okay, the traditional way of cutting basil is to stack a few leaves up, roll them up, and very thinly slice it. This cut is called a chiffonade, and it's a pain in the ass because they always get tangled up, and as a matter of fact, you know what it reminds me of? This shit right here. That's what it reminds me of. So if you've ever looked behind your television and thought to yourself, gee, I wonder what the food version of this would be. Chiffonade basil, that's the answer. So now that you know that the chiffonade cut sucks ass, let's head back over to the stovetop and finish putting this thing together. I've drained off the pasta, reserving a little bit of the pasta water, and I'll add a little bit of sauce to a preheated saute pan, and I'm going to add a few handfuls of pasta with that. Give everything a few tosses or stir it with a spatula, and I'm going to work in a small amount of the reserved pasta water as well. And what that's going to do is the starch within that water is going to combine with the pectin I mentioned earlier and make a cohesive sauce that's going to cling to the pasta. And I'm kind of eyeballing this whole thing as I go, and that's the cool thing about this dish. It doesn't have to be exact. Be anywhere in the neighborhood of the ballpark and you're going to wind up with something good. And once you get the consistency of everything where you want it, toss in the chopped basil, stir everything together, and finally for some added richness, finish with a small pat of butter. And the term used for finishing with butter like this is monte beurre, meaning to mount with butter. And once the butter's all melted in and worked in, let's head over to the other side of the kitchen and get this thing plated up. And to plate spaghetti like they do in fancy bourgeois restaurants, you'll need two tools, something to stretch and twirl the pasta and something to use as a base. Pick the pasta up with whatever fork tool you have, untangling it along the way, and try not to grab too much because the more you pile up, the more likely it is to deflate or collapse. And once you have a good grip on the whole thing, use the base to help shape and mold it into a cohesive unit and transfer it over to your plate. And sometimes it holds up better than other times, and there are a variety of factors that contribute to that. But for now, that's the end of the video, so as always, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.